Dizzying variety is one of the interesting features of cheese making. Let's look at the overall process of cheese making. We certainly we certainly don't have time or the need to enumerate all the different varieties of cheeses, but it's worth running through the basics. And this should help you as well as you decide how you're going to make your own cheeses. But of course, we're always going to begin, especially if we're talking about commercially available cheeses, with pasteurization. We've talked about the different varieties of pasteurization from low temperature to high temperature. Typically, it's believed that low temperature pasteurization is going to be best for cheese making, and that's partially again because we don't denature the proteins, which would alter the way that they form the curds. So in any case, some kind of pasteurization takes place, or not if you're doing this on your own with raw milk. And then this two key steps: acidification, addition of rennet. Although we can skip the rennet and simply acidify either with bacterium, or as we're going to do, the addition of citric acid in the form of pure citric acid or lemon juice. You can even use vinegar, although that might affect the flavor in an unpleasant way. And that we follow that acidification with a heat coagulation. This gives us the so-called fresh cheeses. So as I go through this, I might not enumerate all of the ways of categorizing cheeses, but I hope they emerge as obvious to you. Fresh cheeses: paneer, that's an Indian cheese; queso fresco, something maybe more familiar to us here in Southern California. But most of the time we're going to be using rennet, and that's going to allow for the formation of very nice curds. So once the curds form, that's typically as a sort of one single solid gelatinous mass, but we'll typically slice those curds to release the whey, and so that we can separate them more effectively. Excuse me. Again, worth mentioning that we can take the whey that's released and realize that whey is still very rich in non-casein proteins, and we can precipitate those too, again by the application of heat. So we can use heat right away, or we can use it to separate out the whey proteins, and that results in the formation of ricotta, or twice cooked cheese. Lots of ricotta recipes you will see do not involve using the whey expressly. I'll argue that those are maybe a little bit less authentic ricottas, and maybe more honest to consider them queso frescos. But in any case, there are varieties of ways of treating these cheeses as well. So feta is another fresh cheese. We simply brine those curds. Or we can manipulate either by stretching and kneading or by washing and pressing the curds, and we get two very different kinds of cheese out of that, with the stretched curd cheeses, mozzarella and provolone. We'll come back to talking about mozzarella as an important American cheese. And then we can wash the curds and press out more water, and often this is going to involve the use of a wax rind. Those are the Dutch cheeses. Edam, Gouda, Jack cheeses are considered washed and pressed cheeses. Again, we learned about the use of waxes in the rinds. Those are cheese. This is going to require that those cheeses have some organisms that are present that can help age the cheese from the inside out. So what have we talked about? We've talked about fresh cheeses. We've talked about wax cheeses. What else? Well, so in this case, all we've gotten to do is remove the curds from the whey. We've got one class of cheeses, or a couple classes of cheeses that emerge from that. Let's think about some others. The moldy cheeses, as I've mentioned, are very important classes of cheeses. There's quite a variety of those. We don't use this temperature step, so let's keep that in mind. Before we heat those up, we'll go ahead and add our molds. We can inoculate with molds directly, or we can hope that the molds can be derived from some ambient source, say a nice damp cave. We have the soft moldy cheeses, the bloomy rind white cheeses, camembert. We've seen that already. We've seen the washed rind or Limburger cheeses, so there's a different kind of rind cheese. We've seen the blue cheeses, typically Gorgonzola, Roquefort Stilton is what we're talking about there. So, but in these cases, the curds have been treated very gently, and not further processed either by pressure or by temperature. That's important for the development of those often crumbly and creamy characteristics of those cheeses. However, we can also add another step to our cheese preparation, which is heating it from 100 to or maybe 130 degrees. Remembering we're not boiling this by any stretch of the imagination. That would cause all the proteins to denature and precipitate, radically changing the structure of the curd. Okay, so a gentle heating, and this can drive off more water, and we have a variety of ways that we'll treat that, from gentle pressing to firm pressing, and all this is doing is releasing less or more water from the cheese, and this results in the semi-hard or semi-firm cheeses to the very firm cheeses. So Tom, Manchego, those are our semi-firm cheeses, all the way down to the very familiar hard cheeses, Parmesan and Romano. Those are the extremes. Also worth mentioning cheddaring, and I'm going to come back to this in a slide. This is very common English cheese, almost worth considering this to be a processed cheese. The curds are milled and then pressed into molds, and this is part of the rise of industrialization of the cheese-making industry, as your book describes and as we'll see. So we've got fresh cheeses, we've got soft cheeses, we've got moldy cheeses, we've got semi-firm and hard cheeses. We've got waxy rinds, we've got washed rinds, we've got bloomy rinds. Beautiful. But let me just remind us that the only things that are really required is the coagulation of proteins using acid and or rennet, and the separation of the curds that result from the whey. And what we do with the curds gives rise to this whole wonderful family of cheeses. Oh, this is a fun slide. I got this from the USDA. Changes in the cheese consumption in pounds of cheese per year per person from the years 1970 to 2003. This is an important period in my life. Interesting to see, though, that overall we've maybe doubled in the amount of cheese that we're eating as a people. I won't focus so much on all of these various dairy consumption modes. Just to point out that the one interesting thing that's really happened that hasn't stayed constant is the emergence of mozzarella as an important cheese. And we see this going from maybe 1 pound a year up to 7 or 8 pounds per year. That's a huge change in a short period of time, and this has everything to do with the emergence of fast food and processed cheeses in restaurant delivery of foods. Maybe in particular, interesting to think about the expansion of pizza delivery over this period. Certainly something that's very uncommon before 1970, but massively important to the American diet today. And that's reflected in our mozzarella cheese consumption. Cheddar, of course, is a very important cheese excuse me, in the American diet. American cheese we'll talk about briefly at the end of this lecture. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about some of the individual cheeses. I really love blue cheese, and it's really interesting, so I'm showing you some photographs here. This is a Stilton that's been cut in half. This is a natural rind cheese. Remember, we haven't washed or treated this rind, haven't washed the rind, haven't covered it in cheesecloth, haven't covered it in wax. So whatever's happening on the exterior is up to the set of organisms that are present where we're letting the cheese age. In this case, that's the introduction of Penicillium mold. The Penicillium mold is responsible for the discoloration that we see, as well as all of the wonderful flavors that we associate with the blue cheeses. So typically, we're talking about Stilton from England, Roquefort from France, Gorgonzolas from Italy, although there are plenty of other blue cheeses that we can think about. These are protected names. This is the so-called protected designation of origin that's applied in the European Union to a variety of food types. We'll encounter these again as we discuss other food categories, but definitely to the Stiltons, which are only can only be called Stiltons if they're made in a certain way in a certain region of England. Roquefort and Gorgonzola identical restrictions to the use of those names. Something interesting that we heard about last week in the making of blue cheese is needling, and I showed you this image, and I'll show it to you again. Using stainless steel needles to introduce holes into the cheese to allow for the penetration of air, which the molds need in order to grow and develop. Here's more examples of the needling process. So on the left here, we're looking at the natural rind of that Stilton, and we can see all of the holes that have been introduced, and basically from all sides and from the top and bottom. And if we look at a transverse section of that cheese, we see that the needle holes pass through, and the molds don't always follow precisely that those needle pathways, but the needle holes are critical for the more rapid aging of the cheese. I wanted to mention cheddaring as well. These are a nice series of photographs brought down from Wikipedia. We see that the curds are formed into loaves, and those loaves are sliced into uniform size. Then the loaves are then milled, and the milling can be by hand or by machine, and the curds are milled into uniform fragments, a couple of centimeters on a side, and the curds are then poured into molds, and those molds are pressed until they become again a uniform cheese. And then these are usually historically wrapped in wax rinds, now more common to use some sort of plastic films. So again, cheddar cheeses are cheeses that require the organisms to develop on the interior of the cheese, as opposed to those moldy or bloomy rind cheeses where the ripening is happening from the outside in. Important to note that cheddar cheese is a really important cheese in the United States, originated in England, and is an extremely important cheese in Britain as well. But has been around for many centuries, maybe as much as 1,000 years. But it's also important to note that the rise of cheddar cheese really coincides with the industrialization of the West and the industrialization of food in particular. So we won't call cheddar cheese a processed cheese, but it is a departure from the sort of handmade process or artisan process that we emphasized last week. Let's talk about cooking with cheese. Melting cheeses. So in the case of the melting, we like to find a cheese that will be high in milk fats. Those milk fat melts, the casein networks collapse, and that's something that happens more with mozzarella. We see a melty or stretchy cheese. And low moisture cheeses like Parmesan, like the pressed cheeses, the hard cheeses, we have a tighter network of caseins and less water, and therefore less collapse and more stability in those networks. So these cheeses don't melt with the same sort of stretchy characteristics. We have cheeses that do not melt. Acid curdle cheeses, they form these brittle quiche curds, and those just dry out, and they don't melt very well. This might be familiar to many of your experience. You get a very different kind of pizza when you use feta cheese as your cheese product as opposed to mozzarella. Just a difference in the structure of the aggregated protein network, as we'll see again and again. You can get some stringy cheeses that form when they begin to melt. These tend to be low in fat, they're unaged, they have long casein networks, and again, mozzarella is a sort of an example of this. In aged cheeses, there's a lot of protein degradation, and so they can melt very easily and readily, and they're already mostly liquid. For example, Camemberts, Bries, right? Those protein networks have already been degraded before we apply any heat. In fondues, we can use acids to destabilize the casein network, and this allows, again, for the formation of a sort of a gooey texture that's useful if we want to dip our pieces of sizzling steak into the cheese. I'm not going to mention much about processed cheeses. I don't have a slide about them. I did give you a reading. Processed cheeses are new on the scene in the 20th century. Really, the represent the industrialization of cheese. We'll generally look down on products like Velveeta and Cheese Whiz if we're into high quality foods. But I'll assert that they really just represent maybe the tip of the iceberg. Where we'll eventually go in this class is thinking about the use of modern ingredients, industrial ingredients perhaps, that allow us to manipulate the food experience in radical ways. And maybe processed cheeses are the sort of the low class version of some of those experiments that we'll talk about. In any case, processed cheeses are cheeses that have been treated with emulsifiers, sometimes milk fats, sometimes more oils, that make for a cheese with highly controllable melting characteristics. In some cases, they're almost liquid at room temperature. Think about your nacho cheeses that you see. In other cases, Velveeta, they're more solid. So we can, again, that's all about controlling the characteristics of the food using non-traditional ingredients or additives, as we'll see as we move along. Have fun.